Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is a detailed build guide on the Corsair Frame 4500X, in which I'm going to show you how to craft in the case in the easiest way possible with the standard pre-installed fans and then just adding a 360mm all-in-one cooler to the top. But later on in the video, I'm also going to show you how to side mount the cooler and add in additional fans to the case. This setup is preferable because in my testing, which you'll see in the full review of the case, I found that it offered better cooling performance for both the CPU and the GPU. It does require extra expense and it is a bit more complicated though. I'm going to leave timestamps down below so you can jump to the relevant points and skip bits that you already know. But stick with me as I show you what the case looks like and how we break it down and how you take it apart, because there's actually some things to know here in taking it apart and putting it back together that make it a little bit complicated. First of all, obviously removing that tape there that's held in place to keep it secure nicely in transit. Then to take off the wraparound glass panel, you have to tug it out to the right and then lift it up so it sort of slides out to the right, which isn't necessarily intuitive, but as you'll see, it notches into the case. You have to get your fingers kind of through the glass at the back here and then pull it out. It doesn't come off easily, which is good news because it means it won't fall off, but it is a little bit fiddly to get off the first time you try and take it off. The rear panel comes off really easily, just pulls away from the top and then comes out. But the left-hand panel, the airflow panel, needs to be pulled out from the bottom first and then lifted up out of the top. It's actually removed from the top of the case, which is a little bit counterintuitive, and you need the top on in order to put it back together again, as I'll show you later on. Obviously, make sure you remove all the tape and the additional packaging that was there for the transit. We want that out of the way during the build process. Now, we've got it stripped down. I wanted to show you some other things of interest here. You'll notice, for example, that the airflow panel has its own built-in dust filter in there. You'll need to take this off occasionally to give it a good clean, because obviously otherwise dust is going to get into the case through that. The top panel doesn't have any dust filtering on it. And as mentioned, you need to remove the rear panels first before you can take it off. And it's secured with 2 thumb screws at the rear, and then you just unscrew that and pop that off. Now you can see the case is stripped down, and obviously we've got the pre-installed fans there that are wired up together. And I'll get to the wiring and setup of those later on and how to connect them to your motherboard. You'll also see at the back that they're tied up nicely as well. Now, the accessories box is worth getting out next. In here, you'll find all the screws and other things we're going to need for this, nicely contained in a little plastic box and segmented out. And once you've taken this apart, you can then obviously get all of these screws into the relevant bits. Keep them nicely contained there so you don't lose them. This is very handy and a nice bit of the setup. One thing to note here is there are also plastic cable ties in this little box, and you are going to need those, especially if you're doing a rear connect motherboard setup. You might not use all of the screws in here as well, depending on what you're putting into the case, so you don't necessarily need to panic there. The long screws on the right, for example, are for the bottom fans, so if you're not putting those in, you won't use those. So next we're going to get to the wiring and setup of the power supply unit so we can manage the cables. Here I'm using Corsair's RM Shift power supply unit, which is a modular power supply where you only need to plug in the cables you're actually going to be using. The logic I'm about to show you will apply to most modular power supply units though, so if you're using a different one, it doesn't matter. You can still follow along nice and easily with this. I'm going to show you the cables we need to plug in, starting with the 24-pin power cable for the motherboard. So this is an important cable that has 2 connections on one end. You'll notice they're smaller than the other end. And these are Type 5 connectors that plug in on the motherboard section of the power supply unit, as you can see on the left-hand side here. Now, it's important that you plug in both parts of this. I've seen people in the past commenting that they had issues with their PC not starting, and it turns out it's just because they haven't plugged in the second part of this cable to the power supply. Something simple like that can make a difference. Also making sure those cables are properly plugged in. The other end then plugs into the right-hand side of the motherboard. I'm showing you here outside the case, so it's really easy to see, but it plugs in there, clips in, and pushes into the socket. Then you have 2 CPU power connectors, and they're marked CPU on the end that plugs into the motherboard, and the other end plugs into the ports marked PCIe and CPU on the power supply end. So you plug those in and then you connect them up to the motherboard once everything's installed. Plugging these cables in now to the power supply makes life easier, and then you'll run the cables through the case and plug them into the top left of the motherboard, as you can see me doing. I'll show you this later on again once it's actually installed in the case, but I want you to see it now. Sometimes you might have a motherboard that only requires one 4-pin connector and then one 8-pin. You can split these cables apart, as you can see here, so you can do that if you need to, and this can be handy for making sure your motherboard's fully connected up. Or you could put it together and just have it in as 2 8-pins, which is the usual setup, but it does vary from motherboard to motherboard. Do make sure these are plugged in though, so you get the most out of your system. Now we're on to the SATA power cables. These are used for SSDs, hard disk drives, RGB controllers and other things. These are flat connectors. They have a Type 5 connector on one end that plugs into the power supply unit. Then you've got multiple connectors, so you can connect multiple things to one cable. Plug them into the SATA/PATA ports on the top row here, and then you can connect up other things to them once they're installed. So I'm going to be using these for SSDs, for example, in this build. If you don't use SSDs, you don't need this cable, but it plugs in, as you can see, to this port here. It has an L-shaped connector on it, so you can only plug it in one way around. Watch out for the little notched edge on it. The other port on that drive is for the data cable, which we'll get to in a second. This also works with hard disk drives, and you can connect both SSDs and hard disk drives to the same chain of cables. So obviously with multiple connectors, you can connect multiple things, and I'll show you later on this can also be used for an RGB controller if you want to add loads of extra fans into the case. So fairly straightforward powering of these. You just then need to connect the data cables, which should come with your motherboard, to your SSD, and then to the SATA port on your motherboard, which is usually on the right hand side somewhere below the 24-pin power connector. As you can see me connecting up here, you'll need one cable per SSD or hard disk drive. You can only fit 2 of these in the case anyway, so you'll only need 2 cables. For GPUs, the wiring is slightly different depending on the graphics card you're using, but you will find there are multiple PCIe power cables in the box with your power supply unit that you can use for plugging in. You'll see they're marked PCIe on the end that plugs into the graphics card. The other end plugs into the power supply units. Now, I'm using a 3090 here as a demonstration. This requires 2 8-pin power connectors. This will also be the case for older GPUs, for Intel GPUs, and for AMD GPUs, that you'll need 2 or 3 8-pin PCIe power cables for your graphics card. So if you're using an AMD GPU, the logic will be the same. In order to connect it up, you have to pinch together the 6-pin and the 2-pin connectors and put them into the ports. You'll notice there's a little plastic hook on top of the power supply cable and a notch on the port. So you need to make sure it's pushed all the way in and fully seated there, and do the same for both cables so that you've got 2 cables connected up to it. They then plug into the PCIe/CPU power cable connectors on the power supply end, and then you've got your GPU powered. Now, obviously, I'm only using 2 cables here. If you need 3, you can do the same. Just put an additional 3rd cable onto that connector and plug those in. But that's the basic wiring of a graphics card once it's fully installed in the system. With an NVIDIA 40 or 50 series GPU, you'll require this 12-volt high power connector instead of a 12-volt 2x6. On one end, it's the Type 5 connector, plugs into the power supply. On the other end, you'll find this tiny little connector here, which has loads of pins on it. Same sort of logic. We plug it into the PCIe/CPU power connector on the power supply unit, and then the other end plugs into the graphics card. Make sure these cables are fully seated and pushed all the way in, both on the power supply and on the GPU. It's very important. So this is a 4070, but this will also work with 50 series cards. You can see you just need to make sure that connector's pushed in and fully seated in there, and then that will give you the necessary power for that. So those are all the things you need if you're doing all the things I am, and if you are doing less, you won't need the SSDs, for example, then you don't put that cable in. But I'd recommend plugging in all the cables now, just so you can easily do it and work out which cables you're going to want plugged in there. And then we can put the power supply into the case and start to manage these cables ready in preparation for everything else. So in order to do that, what you want to do is to put it in so the fan faces down towards the bottom of the case. That way it'll get air from below. And then we'll use the power supply screws that come with the power supply. But you can also use these silver thumb screws at the back to secure it to the back of the case as well. So there's 2 of those, is you can secure it like that. But then we can put in additional screws. So they're included with the power supply unit. They're hexagonal top screws. You screw them into the relevant holes at the back here to make sure it's fully secure. And there are several points where you'll be able to screw those in so it's nice and tightened up. Then what we're going to do is try to neaten these cables up before we go about building fully. So I'm going to start with the two 8-pin CPU power cables. You'll run those through the right hand side. You'll find that there are various Velcro loops at the edge of the case here that you can put these into. It's handy to do this now because it makes sure they're out of the way during the build for the rest of it, especially if you're using a rear connect motherboard, as I'll show you in a little while. But what we can do is you can run these up through the various loops there, keeping those cables nice and tidy and tidying as we go. This is really worthwhile doing, and in a little while I'll show you how to use the plastic cable ties for other cables to make sure everything's nice and neat. We can also do the same with the 24-pin power cable. We'll just put it down under the Velcro ties for now, so it's kind of tidy because it is a thicker cable. In this guide, I'm going to show you how to use both standard motherboards and rear connect motherboards. So I want to start with the standard motherboard and show you how to set that up and how to wire it in. If you want to see the rear connect motherboard, use the timestamps to jump forward in the video. But for the installation, we're going to need these screws that come in the accessories box. And then what you want to do is take your standard motherboard and seat it over the standoffs that are already in there. If you're using an ATX motherboard, it will sit down over the standard pre-installed standoffs fairly easily. You just need to line up the holes on the motherboard, putting it in like this and gently putting it into place. We then need to use those screws that I showed you to install into the various holes here. You'll find 3 holes along the bottom, 2 in the middle and 3 along the top. Make sure that you secure the motherboard across all of these points so it's well held in place there and nicely secured into the case. A fairly straightforward setup for an ATX motherboard, and then we just need to plug in the cables. So I'm going to start with the 8-pin CPU power cables. You run them through the gap at the top of the case here and then through to the front. It's a little bit fiddly to do, but you'll eventually get those through there. And also at the same time, we can put the 24-pin power cable through the gap there as well. Adjust your cable so it's looking pretty neat and then try and get it through the gap on the side here. Once you've done that, you can then flip the case over and we can access the other side. And you can then plug those cables in. So the 24-pin power cable, as I showed you, plugs in on the right-hand side here. Make sure it is fully connected up and pushed into place. It has that little clip on the edge of it, so it can only be pushed in one way. Just make sure it is firmly pushed in and clicks into place nicely there. Then the two 8-pin CPU power connectors, same logic, top left corner. Make sure they're hooked over the ports properly. Push into place there and clipped in. You'll want to tidy up the cables at this point as well. Try and push a lot of it back through to the rear so it looks neater at the front. Now I want to show you the front panel connectors and other things. So under the Velcro ties you'll find a bundle of different cables in here. This includes the fan cables and other things. You'll see we've got USB-A and USB-C connections here. So the small one's USB-C, the other one's the USB-A connection. These are for the front port connectors. So run those through at the side here, just near where the 24-pin power connector is. Usually both of these will plug into the ports right near the 24-pin power connector. That's where they are on most motherboards, as you can see them here on this board, for example. They should be clearly marked, but if they aren't, refer to the motherboard manual and then you'll find them in there and reference where they are. But most of the time you'll find them below the 24-pin connections. It's slightly different on this motherboard, but the USB-C one plugs in here. Now you can only plug this cable in one way, so push it in until you hear it click. If it doesn't click, it's the wrong way around. So watch out for that. And then for the USB-A connection, that also has a little notch on it, so you can only plug that in one way. On this motherboard, it's actually side mounted, so it has to plug in here underneath the anti-sag bracket, which makes it a little bit fiddly. Next up, front panel and HD audio. So this is the power button and your 3.5mm jack. HD audio goes on the right hand side here at the back, so it pushes through there. It'll actually plug in on the left hand side. With the excess cable, you can tuck it under the Velcro ties and tidy that up. And then the front panel connection goes on the other side and plugs in there. So front panel connection plugs in on the right hand side of the motherboard, which you'll see here, usually marked F panel. Watch out because you need to make sure it's plugged in on that one section that you can see here, which has power switch, reset switch and other bits. Again, refer to your manual if you get stuck with this, but it's fairly straightforward most of the time. It's missing a pin, so it's easy to install. The same for HD audio, which is sometimes marked F audio on the motherboard, and that's on the left hand side. It's usually the far left connector, and that's missing a pin as well, so the cable will only plug in one way. So just plug both of those in and that's that sorted. Then we have the power and RGB connections for the 3 intake fans. So you'll find at the top of the case there's a couple of connectors, and in the bottom of the case you have these two. So these are the ones that connect to the motherboard, chassis fan power or system fan power, and then the 5V RGB connections. So find somewhere that those will plug in. On my motherboard it's the bottom middle, and that's the case in most instances. So you're looking for chassis fan or system fan power, and then an RGB connection with 3 pins on it, usually marked something like 5V RGB. So we want to make sure those are both plugged in. You'll see that this motherboard also has some at the top right, but hopefully you've got the connectors for the RGB, and fan power is going to be easy. But what you're looking for is that 3-pin 5V RGB connector for the RGB connection from these fans. With just those 2 connectors, we're powering all 3 fans. So it's nice and straightforward in terms of the wiring and setup of that. And this is what the end result looks like in terms of the motherboard being wired up. And now we're onto the rear connect motherboard. So I'm going to show you the setup of that. I'm using a B650E Stealth Ice board along with a Ryzen 9 9950X3D. And also the Nautilus 360 RS ARGB, which I've got a separate setup guide on. But in this instance, what I want to do is prep the motherboard for this cooler basically immediately. So what we want to do here is to start setting up the socket for it. Just makes life easier to do it outside the case. First of all, we need to remove the bracketing above and below the CPU socket that comes pre-installed on that. So we just have to unscrew the socket and take off the little plastic clips that are above and below that, so that we can then use the Corsair mounting brackets for this. So you'll see that these little standoffs have little grey plastic bits on them. Those screw into the motherboard around the corners. So basically going in where those plastic clips came off of the motherboard, we're putting these in place instead. The cooler will then seat down over the top of these so that you can then easily get that set up so that it makes good contact with the CPU once that's installed. It's easy to do this now because it's much more fiddly when it's in the case, so it's easier to do when you can see what you're doing. Also at this stage, installing the NVMe SSD. So on this motherboard, there's just a little clip there. You remove the heat sink and then you seat the drive into the socket. I'm using a Crucial P310 for this build, slotting it into the socket at the top, then using the little plastic latch on the left hand side to click it into place. Seen from a different angle, you can see how it slots into the socket there and then how it's secured. Sometimes you might need a screw to hold it down depending on your motherboard, but the important point is to make sure you put the heat shield back on without the sticker on the thermal pad. So the thermal pad makes good contact with the NVMe drive, and this will help dissipate heat and keep that drive cool so it runs properly when in use. Next up, we're installing the CPU. So to do that, you remove the lever and lift the little latch here to expose the socket. Take great care here because you don't want to damage the pins on the socket because they're very delicate. We also want to watch out for the little gold arrow that's pointing up to the top left, because you'll see that on the CPU as well. That gives you an idea of where the CPU installs and how. Gently seat it into the socket, lining the little notches up and that arrow, and then put it down, put the latch back down over the top, secure the lever like so, and so the CPU is fully seated into the socket nicely there. Next, we're installing the RAM. So you want to make sure you install your RAM in the 2nd slot and the 4th slot. So what you want to do here is to put the RAM into this position. You can only put it in one way, so don't force it. You need to make sure the RAM is the right way round and push down into the socket until it clicks into place. So I'm using 2 sticks here of DDR5 RAM, and you make sure that both those sockets are filled in. Make sure you use those 2, otherwise it won't run at the right speed and it might not even boot properly. To install a rear connect motherboard, this is an ATX board. It fits over the pre-installed standoffs nice and easily, but you do need to be careful because obviously the connectors are at the back, so be very careful when you're putting it in that you don't force it in there and damage the connectors. You then have to remove multiple panels so we can then access the holes to secure it to the case. For securing it to the standoffs, use these screws to screw in the motherboard into the standoffs. And what you want to do is to secure it in various points. You'll find 2 across the middle, 3 across the bottom, 3 across the top. So just secure the motherboard to those various different points and make sure it's fully screwed in there. and that will ensure that it's in place and ready to go with the rest of the build. So once that's done, you can then put the panels back on to cover over the screw holes, and then the stealth board looks a lot nicer like this. And then we'll get to the setup of the cabling and other things at the rear. Things are a little bit trickier with the rear connect board because you'll find some of the cables are covering the ports that we need to access, which means we have to manage the cables more than you would with a standard motherboard. You can see here, for example, the front panel connectors, ARGB connectors, system fan connectors. So what I'm doing here is basically trying to move the cables over to the right hand side a little bit more. Now you can still use some of the Velcro ties to secure them, but what I found is still the cables are getting in the way a little bit. So we'll use plastic cable ties for that in a second. But the 8-pin CPU power connector plugs in on the top right. With this motherboard, there's only one of these cables. So you can see we won't need that second one from the power supply unit. But you'll make sure that that is notched in place here at the top right and plugged in. And then what we want to do is to deal with some of these other cables. Now, what I found is that some of the ports down here, the USB-A port, for example, is hidden behind a bunch of cables and the Velcro tie there. So what I had to do is use the plastic cable ties and the various hoops at the back of the case to basically secure the cables out of the way. Now, I've done this around some of the cables from the fans, for example, by securing the connectors themselves and the fan cables into these points to pull them away from the ports. This will make life easier when plugging things in, but it does mean a lot of fiddling around trying to make sure these cables are tidied up. I'd also suggest doing it at the bottom here where the Velcro tie is no longer usable because it will be blocking the ports there. So just tidying this up now makes life a lot easier later on. So we can tidy those cables and get them out of the way of the various ports. Now we've got the various different front panel connections. Now these are excessively long when we're using a rear connect motherboard. So what I've done here is I've tied it to the bottom of the case near the power supply unit. There's a couple of loops down the bottom there that you can use for this. This secures some of the excess of the cable so you can then run the connectors. So the USB-A one, for example, plugs in here in the bottom left of the motherboard. On some motherboards, it will be closer to the 24-pin power cable. But again, this is sticking out, so another cable that I basically managed down and tied with this tie to the loop here so that the excess of it is out of the way. I'll make it easier to close the door at the end when we finish the build. And also obviously trimming those plastic cable ties. The USB-C connector plugs in a little bit further up the motherboard on the left hand side here. This only plugs in one way round, so make sure when it goes in it clicks into place. We've then got extra cable to manage as well here, so that once again also needs to be tied down so it's held out of the way. You can see this is a little bit tricky with a rear connect motherboard. There are a lot of cables that you need to manage and tie down, so there's a little bit of effort that needs to go in here, but it's worth doing it at this stage. Front panel connector plugs in the bottom left. This port is actually bigger than you need, but what you want to do is watch out for the bit that says reset and power switch on that side of the port. Check your motherboard manual if you're not sure, but it should connect up fairly easily. And then HD audio goes on the right hand side. This is for the 3.5mm jack. This will only plug in one way because it's missing a pin, so it's fairly easy to deal with. Then the connectors for the 3 fans, which is just 2 connectors, one for the system fan header and one for 5V RGB, which is ARGB V2 on this case, for example. So you plug the power into the system fan header, and then the other one goes into that 3-pin connector, and that will then give you the power and the RGB for all 3 of those intake fans on the side of the case. And then we've got some excess cable, which we can just get out of the Velcro tie on the right-hand side there. And then the 24-pin power cable, which I've left to last because it's a bit chunkier. But what you want to do here is to plug that in up at this part and make sure it is fully clipped into place and held down there. And then try and tidy that up as much as possible. Get rid of any of the excess plastic cable ties that we've got there. Neaten things up and sort that out, because you don't want those sticking out messily. And then we can use the Velcro tie to secure the 24-pin power cable, so that's neatened up and flattened down as much as possible, because it might get in the way otherwise. Now this is the basic setup. Obviously the motherboard setup and the intake fans on the side are all wired, but now you need to put the cooler in. I'm initially going to show you how to mount it on the top of the case for a really straightforward build, but later I want to show you how to instead mount it on the side, use the reverse blade fans as intake fans, and then add additional fans into the case as well. If you'd rather do that, then you can obviously skip forward a little bit. But what I want to show is the basic logic of how this works. I've also got a separate wiring guide on the fans and on this cooler that I'll link to in the description that might help. But for the basic setup, we want to put the fans so that they're facing towards us, as in down into the case for exhaust purposes. Pay attention to the logic of how you install the fans, because you want the cables to be facing towards the back of the case once you install the radiator into the case. Then use the long screws that come with the all-in-one cooler to secure the fans that come with it to the radiator, so that they're set up and all secured like this. By the end of it, it should be fully secured with a lot of screws set up there. And then you've got a lot of cables to deal with, which can look intimidating. But the cables are male and female versions of the power and RGB connections. Take the male connector for the fan power one from the first fan and plug it into the female connector in the middle fan, and then repeat that process on the next fan to the next fan. That way the chain of power is going from the right to the left. And then have a similar logic with the RGB connection. So female plugs into the male connector on the middle fan, and then the next one runs into the next fan. So you have to remove the little plastic caps on the male connectors here in order to do that, where we plug those in and chain up the RGB. So now both fan power and RGB is connected up from the two fans to that final one, and then you can plug in the other connectors. So here what I'm doing is I'm running the 5-volt RGB connector, the male connector from the pump, to that fan as well. That way all the RGB for the fans and the pump is connected together. Then you have these extension leads. So this is the fan power extension lead. This runs from the end of the chain of fans on the radiator to the motherboard. Then you have the RGB one, and that runs from the pump to the motherboard. So you plug those in a logical way. It's basically chaining things together. So for the fan power one, from the final male connector on the fan on the radiator, you can see we've got the extension lead plugged in. And then for the RGB one, the male plugs into the female of the pumped RGB connector. And then that extension lead is ready to go into the motherboard. So the pump plugs into the AIO pump header, the fan power connection plugs into the CPU fan, and the 5-volt RGB connection plugs into the motherboard. So you can see the basic logic of what that looks like with the fans, but we want to loop everything together so it's all set up nicely and easy to control. So to install the radiator on the top of the case, I'm putting the tubes on the left-hand side here. Notice the fan power cables are at the back of the radiator, so it's nice and neat. What we want to do here is to essentially run the cables through to the rear so we can keep things tidy. So try and run those through the gap before you install the cooler. It'll make your life a lot easier here. Obviously, we have the extension leads to run through to the rear. We're also going to have to deal with the black cables from the pump in a little while to make sure that they're chained together and that everything's connected up nicely to the motherboard. And I'll show you that. Once again, as a reminder, I'm going to change this radiator setup later on. So if you want to install it on the side instead, stick around for that, or use the timestamps to skip forward. Now, to install it to the top of the case, we first need to undo the InfiniRail setup at the top because it's actually set to be wider. So we want to set it to the 120mm setup here, so you can install the radiator to this InfiniRail setup at the top. Then you use the small screws that come with the all-in-one cooler and the washers to secure it at multiple points along the top so that it is then held in place at the top there. So you use all the screws that you can, and then you've got a bit of a gap at the rear to run those cables through so you can access it from the top quite nicely. Now to install the cooler over the socket. First of all, in order to do this, we need to remove the standard bracket that comes on the cooler. So take that off and replace it with the AMD bracket, which is straighter, as you'll see. Notice also we've got thermal paste on the cooler, so you can just seat that down over the CPU and you don't need to worry about your own thermal paste. So this is then installing over the top of the standoffs that we put in place earlier on the motherboard. You're seating it down over the top of there, and then there's 4 thumb screws that you have to use to secure it in place. So I'd recommend putting those in place individually, securing from corner to corner, making sure you secure nicely. Tighten it up by hand first of all, and then use a screwdriver to secure them more tightly. Secure them until they stop. Don't force them, but you'll find they stop eventually as you're trying to tighten them. Then we've got to run the cables from the pump through to the rear. As a reminder, we're going to connect the pump itself to the AIO pump header, and then use the additional RGB connection to basically connect it up to the fans as well. So the male connector from the pump is going to connect up to one of the female connections on the fans that are attached to the radiator, and that way the fan RGB and the pump RGB will match up. Plug the black cable from the pump into the AIO pump header, and then the white cable from the fans, the extension lead for that, into the CPU fan header. I'm actually using CPU optional in this instance in this build because that's all I had spare. And then what you can do is you can take the RGB cable from the fans and plug it into the RGB cable on the fans on the case. So at the top of the connections, you'll find there's a male connector here which plugs into that. So now we've chained all the fans on the radiator to the fans on the case in terms of the RGB lighting, and you only need to use one 5-volt RGB connector on your motherboard. Or you can connect them up to a separate one if you prefer, but it does mean that all the fans are easily connected to one RGB connection, and all the RGB is therefore synced. So that's the basic setup there. Now we're going to install the GPU. So in order to do that, you remove the PCIe brackets at the back of the case. This GPU is only 2 slots deep, so I only need to remove 2 of these. If you've got a fatter one, you might need to remove more. But then we'll take the graphics card and we're going to put it into that top PCIe X16 slot up there. And then you just need to line up the little silver pins on the back of the graphics card with the very edge of the PCIe brackets, making sure they slot in alongside the motherboard. Push it into the socket gently until it clicks into place, and then re-secure it at the edge on those brackets with the screws we took out a minute ago from those back plates, and that will then make sure it's secured nicely up that end as well. And so that's the basic setup of the graphics card into the port. Pretty straightforward to do that. Once that's in place, you can then use the anti-sag bracket. So unscrew that and you'll be able to shift it up towards the GPU. There's also this additional bit that you can put on top of it so that it doesn't press up against the fan. So you can put that on the anti-sag bracket, secure it in place by screwing it back in, and then check it's not pressing up against the fan, but that will then support the GPU. Then we run the power cable through to the front for the graphics card. This is the 12-volt high power connector. So we're running it through from the underneath, as you can see, and plugging it into the port. Make sure that this isn't under a load of tension, that it's loose enough and easy enough to plug in so that it's fully connected and seated all the way in, especially with a 50 series card. You want to make sure there's no unnecessary tension on the port there that could cause it to come loose. Next up, SSD installation. So in order to do that, we remove this back plate, and then you can use this to mount either hard disk drives or SSDs to it. I'm going to put 2 SSDs on here to show you how. So what you want to do here is basically put them on like this so that you're lining up the screw holes with the holes on the rear of it. Make sure the ports are facing down towards the bottom. So we pop that in, and then we put the smallest screws from the accessories box into the screw holes here. And you've got 4 screws per SSD, and then putting that in and securing it up so it ends up looking something like this. The idea here is that the ports will be on the bottom of this so you can easily plug in the cables for it. As you can see, the mounting of that's fairly straightforward. You then slot the bracket back into place and then screw it back in with the thumb screw. Then use the SATA power cables that I showed you earlier on to plug into the SSDs, and you can use 2 connectors from that one cable to plug those in. And then the data cables plug in to the SSDs as well, and then you run them to the SATA ports on the left-hand side, as you can see here, and plug those into the motherboard so that they can then transfer data easily. And then we need to tidy up these cables as well and sort those out because there's more cable mess to deal with. Now that's all installed, we can just put things back together. So don't forget you need to put the lid back on the case before you can install anything else. So pop that on, slide it into place, secure it with the thumb screws at the back, and then you can put the other panels on. So the rear panel goes on like this, covering over our cable shame, and you can pop that into place. And then the airflow panel hooks on from the top and then clips on at the bottom. So you then push that into place as well. And then with the wraparound panel, you first of all want to make sure you remove the plastic from the inside of the glass. Otherwise, it's not going to look very neat. Take care when doing this, because it's quite stiff, I found, quite difficult to get that off. There's also plastic on the outside as well, so there's a lot of peel to do here if you enjoy that sort of thing. So you can peel that off nicely as well. To put the wraparound glass panel back on, it's a little bit fiddly. Watch out, there are some notches on the side which you have to line up with holes on the case. Slot it in from the front, slide it in carefully. It's quite fiddly to do, but once that's in place, that's reasonably secure. However, when you go to peel off the plastic, you might find that the glass comes away again depending on the direction you pull it off, because you can see as I'm doing it here, it slides forward. So just watch out for that when you're doing it and make sure you're careful not to pull the glass off in that process. And then you can also remove the instruction peel. As you can see here, we've got that plastic on there, and then there's another sticker at the top here. All of those seem to come off without leaving any residue though, so that's definitely a benefit. Now, as I mentioned, this setup is reasonable. It does pretty well. I showed in the review it's okay. But if you want better performance, you're better off having a side-mounted all-in-one cooler with an intake setup and maybe adding in some additional fans. So it ends up looking like this. This is extra expense and it is a bit more complicated, but I want to quickly show you what I did so you've got an idea of the logic of it and how to do it. This is worthwhile doing because it does help the temperature of the GPU as well as the CPU, dropping the temps of both. So what I'm doing here is I'm removing the radiator that I installed. Obviously, if you want to do this, just don't install it on the top to begin with. I wanted to show you the process that I went through so you can see some of the logic. So my idea here is to keep it mounted to the socket, remove the radiator, remove the fans. What I'm going to do is I'm going to swap the fans that are already on the radiator for the ones that are in the case. So these fans that I've taken off the rad are going to be exhaust fans in a minute. But as you can see, you can mount the radiator on the side here. You can either do it with the tubes at the top or the tubes at the bottom. With the tubes at the bottom, you might struggle depending on the size of your GPU, though. You can see with mine, for example, it's pressing up against the end of the graphics card. If you had a longer graphics card, it might just get in the way completely. So instead, I'm going to put it with the tubes at the top. Now, for longevity, top mounting the radiator is preferable to side mounting, but I've never had an issue running rads like this. I do it in my main build all the time without any problem. So the next goal is taking off the standard fans that are included with the case. These are obviously reverse blade intake fans. So what I'm doing here is removing them from the bracket. The idea being then I'm going to install them on the radiator in a second. So they'll still be the same fans in the same position, but they're going to be on top of the radiator rather than on the case. So now, with them out of the way, put the radiator onto the back of the case like this and mount it back in place with the small screws and the washers. So it's now mounted to the side of the case like this, securing it all the way along with all the little screws and washers that come with all-in-one cooler. So with it mounted in this position, I can then put the reverse blade fans on top of it. So they're still plugged in as a reminder, but what we'll actually do is swap the power connections for this for where they are in a minute to the CPU fan header or CPU optional headers, because that will be more logical than using a system fan header. So we're securing the reverse blade fans to the radiator using the long radiator screws that came with the all-in-one cooler and was used with the fans that came with the cooler as well. Instead, we're going to secure these here like this, and then we'll use the fans that came with the cooler as exhaust fans on the top of the case. You can see that I've still got these all connected together, so it's fairly straightforward to install them on the top of the case and then run the extension cables through to the rear and plug those into the relevant ports. A system fan header would be logical there. We have the screws that came with the fans, and we use those to secure them to the Infini rail so you can screw them into the top of the case. Obviously, fans facing downwards, so you want to see the back of the fan on the top of the case. That way they're pulling air out of the case and exhausting out of the top. Once that's done, we can then sort out the wiring of it. So with those top fans, I'd recommend plugging the power cable into a system fan header or chassis fan header, because they're now obviously just system fans rather than all-in-one cooler fans. And make sure the fans on the radiator are connected up to the CPU fan header, and then try and connect up the daisy-chained RGB connection still to a 5-volt RGB header. So I'm going to add in additional fans here as well. This is a 140mm RS fan, and it has the same logic as the 120mm in that we have all those connections and we have these extension leads. So I'm going to plug in the extension lead for the fan power and the RGB connections to this, and then run those cables through to the rear. So plugging in the male end of that to the female connector on the fan, we can then run that cable through to the rear, and the same logic for the fan power. We connect that up as well. What we're going to do here is basically plug the fan power for this into another system fan header. I wouldn't recommend chaining the fan power for more than 3 fans together, so I wouldn't connect these up to the ones at the top of the case, for example. Use separate connectors, otherwise you might be trying to draw too much power from a single header on the motherboard, which would not be ideal. So with those cables sorted out, obviously we have to run them through to the rear and plug them in at the back. There's a lot of cables now, as you can see. We're going to end up with a lot more cables in the build because of this setup, so it might be a bit messy. You might need to do a bit more tidying. So what I had to do at the rear is to use those Velcro loops that I'd done with the 8-pin CPU power connectors on the right hand side here, run the cables for the fans through those as well to tidy those up. So now with that, I'm going to run the system fan cable to assist fan 2, as you can see here in the bottom middle of the motherboard. Leave the RGB connection for a minute because I'm also going to add in 3 additional fans to the bottom. To do that, we use these long screws that are included in the accessories box. These are 120mm RS fans that I'm putting face down into the case to then pull cold air from below. It's worth noting you can get reverse blade fans separately, so you could use those instead if you want better aesthetics, but I don't have those at the moment. So you secure those face down to the case, and then obviously connecting the fan cables up, so the chain from one fan to the next fan to the next fan with the same sort of logic we did with the fans on the radiator. And that way we can pass the RGB and the fan power through the fans to the rear of the case and then plug those in. Make sure that you obviously have the fans facing a logical way. Make sure, for example, the Corsair logos all line up. The fan cables are facing towards the back of the case, and you try and tidy things up as much as possible. There's a lot of extra cable here, so it does become a little bit messy, a little bit difficult to do. But we find a spare system fan header and plug the fan cables in, and then we just got to deal with the RGB. Now, because we've got so many RGB connections, I'd recommend something like a Thermalright RGB controller. Corsair now has an RGB controller as well, which I'm going to do a separate video on soon. But you can use this Thermalright one, for example, plug your power into it. The extension cable from that then plugs into the end and then into a 5V RGB header. This is useful if you've only got 1 or 2 RGB headers on your motherboard, as I have, meaning we can plug all of those different groups of fans into the Thermalright controller and then plug the connection into the motherboard and just make sure it's got SATA power as well. And then you end up with a case that's fully wired in and set up. So that is now everything connected up, all the fans and the radiator. The case is filled. When you put the door back on, you have to make a bit of effort to make sure the cables are a bit more neatly hidden away, because there's a lot more cables to deal with. But as mentioned, this is better for performance. You then use something like Gigabyte's RGB Fusion or whatever RGB software you have with your motherboard, or something like Signal RGB or Open RGB to control the RGB lighting of the fans and the pump. And as you can see, all the lighting is changing when I go through these various different settings. So it's really easy to control all of it once it's all wired in and connected up, even with that Thermalright controller. And then hopefully you can just happily game away and enjoy your new build. I realize this has been a long video, so hopefully if I helped you out, you'll let me know in the comments down below. And subscribe to see more. Don't forget to check out the review if you want to see how this case performed in the various different setups. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks very much for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.